What you are about to read is not a sanitized account. It is not a military summary or a political briefing or a carefully worded press release drafted by someone who was never cold a day in their life. It is testimony. It is field notes written in pencil on the backs of bark strips because paper ran out in month 2. It is memory, sharp and uneven, the way all true memories are. The Vorath Dominion occupation of what was formerly the Northern Cascades region, spanning approximately 412 square miles of old-growth forest, river basin, mountain ridge, and highland meadow, lasted 19 months and 11 days before a single woman and the network she built ended it. We have gathered testimony from 23 surviving witnesses. We have cross-referenced Dominion military logs seized during the withdrawal. We have interviewed the soldiers who didn't understand what was happening until it was already over. The woman at the center of this account asked us not to call her a hero. She said, "I just knew the trees better than they did." Read what follows and decide for yourself. I want to start before the occupation because you need to understand what she was before you can understand what she became. Or no, that's not right either. She didn't become anything. She just got the chance to be what she already was. Maren Caldwell grew up in the Cascades. Not near them, in them. Her grandfather had been a forest ranger for 31 years before the first Vorath survey drones appeared in the sky, and everyone started realizing that the government wasn't going to be able to fix this one with a press conference. Her mother had been a wildlife biologist. Her father had done something with mycology. He studied the fungal networks under the forest floor, the way trees talk to each other underground, the slow, quiet language of roots and spores. She grew up knowing the name of every tree. She could read weather by the way lichen grew on north-facing rock. She could follow a deer trail in the dark by smell and sound alone. By the time she was 12, she had made her first bow, not a toy, an actual functional recurve bow from ash wood that her grandfather had approved and tested, and she could put an arrow within 2 inches of center at 60 yards. These were not unusual skills for her family. This was just life. When the Vorath came, she was 32 years old and working as a wilderness survival instructor for a company that took corporate executives into the backcountry and made them remember they were animals before they were quarterly projections. She was good at her job. She liked it. She had a little cabin about 6 miles from the nearest road, an outhouse, a wood stove, 2 cats named Ptolemy and General, and a garden that produced more garlic than any one person could reasonably need. She was not a soldier. I want to be very clear about that. The people who came later, the Dominion propagandists, the ones who tried to frame her as some kind of military asset or secret government operative, they were wrong. She was a woman who knew the woods. That's all. That's everything. Cross-reference. Dominion Occupation Protocol 7 Alpha, translated from Vorath Standard. All human settlements within designated security zones will undergo a full weapons assessment and confiscation procedure within 72 hours of occupation. Weapons include, but are not limited to, firearms of all calibers, projectile devices, bladed weapons longer than 4 centimeters, explosive materials, communication equipment capable of broadcasting beyond the local security net, and any technology rated above level 3 on the Dominion Threat Assessment Scale. Compliance is not optional. Non-compliance will be met with force calibrated to the situation. Back to witness testimony, Maren Caldwell. I was in the woods when they came. Not hiding, I didn't even know they were coming. I was 3 days into a solo assessment trip, checking the condition of a trail section that some clients would be using the following month. I had a GPS unit that stopped working on day 2 because of what I later understood was the Dominion's communication suppression field. I had a compass. I had a topo map on waterproof paper. I was fine. I came back to my cabin on the 3rd evening and found the door open and two of my neighbors sitting on my porch looking like the world had ended. Because it had, sort of. Jelena Marchetti was 61 years old, Hungarian by birth, American by 30 years of citizenship, and the toughest person I knew before I became whatever I became. She sat on my porch step with her hands folded in her lap like she was waiting for a bus and said, "They took everything. They have a list. They're very organized." Her husband Gregor, who was 63 and had fought in 2 conflicts before he came to the mountains to grow beets and raise chickens, sat beside her and said nothing. He had the look of a man who was deciding whether to be angry or strategic. I recognized that look later in a lot of people. It was the look you got when you realized that anger without direction was just noise. I said, "What did they take?" Jelena said, "Everything on their list." I went inside. Ptolemy and General had hidden under the bed, smart cats, and were still there, watching me with the intense focused gaze of creatures who understood that something was wrong and had decided that proximity to me was the correct response. I checked the cabin. They'd taken my hunting rifles. Both of them. They'd taken the .357 I kept in the nightstand. They'd taken my compound bow, the nice one, the competition grade one I'd owned for 8 years. They'd taken my broadhead arrows and my field points and even the practice arrows with the rubber tips. They'd taken my hunting knife, the fixed blade one, 5 inches, that my grandfather had given me. They'd left the kitchen knives because apparently the list had a blade length threshold and none of my kitchen knives crossed it. They'd left my fire steel and my compasses. They'd left my maps. They'd left all my wilderness gear, the packs, the tents, the sleeping bags, because none of that was on the weapons list. They'd left the woodworking tools in the shed. I stood in my cabin for a long time, just looking at the spaces where things used to be. Then I went out to the shed and I looked at the woodworking tools, and something in my brain went very quiet and very clear. Not angry, just clear. I thought, okay, I know what wood does, I know what this forest has, I know what I can make. I thought they took away the things they understood as weapons. They had no idea what the forest was. She came to us the next morning with a notebook and a pencil. She always had notebooks, Marin. She was always writing things down. You could tell she'd grown up with a scientist for a parent. And she sat at our kitchen table, and she asked Jelena if she had any linen thread. Jelena looked at her like she'd asked about the weather and said, yes, she had quite a lot of linen thread. She'd been planning to do some embroidery work over the winter. Marin said, I'm going to need it. Then she asked me if I still had my hand tools, my chisels and gouges and the little draw knife I used for shaping wood for projects around the property. I said yes. They weren't on the list, they were hand tools. She nodded and wrote something in the notebook. She asked Jelena what she knew about bow making. Jelena stared at her. I said I'd watched someone make a longbow once, years ago, at a historical demonstration. Marin said, tell me everything you remember. That's what she did for the first week. She went around to every family still in the area. There were about 40 of us scattered across that stretch of forest. Most of us had chosen this life specifically because we wanted to be away from things, which meant we had the skills and the stubbornness to stay when others had evacuated, and she asked questions. What do you know? What do you have? What can you do? She found out that Tomoko Ishii, who lived 2 miles north and maintained the oldest working apple orchard in the county, had spent 20 years making traditional Japanese weapons for a martial arts school before she retired. Tomoko looked at Marin and said quietly that she could make things from wood that would surprise people. She found out that the Delacroix brothers of Benoit and Mathieu, French-Canadian by heritage, loggers by trade, knew everything about which trees would hold weight and which would split, and which were flexible and which were dense. She found out that old Fen Jarvis, who everyone thought was just an eccentric who grew herbs and talked to himself, had spent 8 years as a materials scientist, before he decided he wanted to grow things instead of analyze them. Fenn understood plant fiber at a molecular level. He looked at Marin's list of materials questions, and he said, "I can do this." And he smiled for the first time anyone had seen in what felt like years. By the end of the first week, she had a network. She hadn't called it that. She'd just been asking questions. But by the end of the first week, everyone understood that something was being organized, and everyone had quietly decided to be part of it. Witness testimony, Dona's Pellery recording subject, Fenn Jarvis, materials specialist. She came to me on the 5th day after the confiscation, and she had questions that were not stupid questions. That was the first thing I noticed. A lot of people come to me with questions, and the questions reveal that they don't actually understand what they're asking. They're using words they've heard without understanding what the words mean. Marin's questions were different. She wanted to know about sinew, about plant fibers, about which local trees had the correct combination of elasticity and strength for a self-bow, a bow made from a single piece of wood, no laminate, no modern composite. She wanted to know the material properties of Douglas fir versus yew versus Osage orange. She wanted to know about plant-based adhesives. I told her that Osage orange was probably the best bow wood that existed in the North American continent, but we were slightly outside its natural range. She said, "What's the closest we have?" I said Pacific yew. She said, "I know where 3 of them are." I believed her. She knew the forest like I know my own hands. She had a mental map of this place that was almost frightening in its detail. Not just trails and ridgelines, but individual trees, rock formations, water sources, soil types. She'd built that map over 30 years of paying attention to a place that most people drove past on the highway without a second thought. She asked me about nettle fiber. I must have looked surprised because she said, "My grandmother made nettle cloth. She told me about the processing. I want to know if you can make bow strings from it." I said technically yes. Stinging nettle fiber has been used for cordage and textile for thousands of years. The fiber is quite strong. The issue is the processing. You have to ret the stalks, break down the outer material, separate the long bast fibers. It takes time and it takes knowledge. She said, "We have time, teach me the knowledge." I taught her, and then I taught 4 other people, and then those 4 taught others. By the end of month 1, we had a fiber processing operation running in Yelena's barn that produced more nettle cordage than I would have thought possible from a standing start. It was crude at first. It got better fast. Population compliance assessment, satisfactory. Human subjects in the target zone are not demonstrating organized resistance. They are engaging in subsistence activities consistent with their preoccupation lifestyle. Foraging, gardening, small construction projects observed from aerial surveillance. No communication equipment detected. No weapon signatures detected. Threat level low. Note, some subjects have been observed spending extended time in forested areas. Behavior consistent with cultural practices. These humans use outdoor activity for psychological regulation. No tactical significance. Back to witness testimony, Marin Caldwell. We let them think that. The Vorath had technology that should have made them impossible to fool. They had drones that could read heat signatures. They had sensors that could detect the alloy composition of metal objects. They had cameras that I'm pretty sure could see in wavelengths humans can't perceive. What they didn't have was an understanding of what they were looking at. When their sensors swept the area, they found humans gathering plant material. Accurate. They found humans doing woodworking. Accurate. They found humans processing fiber from plants. Also accurate. None of these things appeared on their threat assessment matrices because none of these things looked like weapons manufacturing. They were wrong. The first bow I made took me 11 days. It was not beautiful. It was functional. I made it from a Pacific yew stave that Benoit Delacroix had identified and helped me split. U is perfect for a self-bow because the outer sapwood, the pale part, handles tension, and the inner heartwood, the dark reddish part, handles compression. You use both together, and the bow does what composite materials try to do with technology. It was a thing people had understood for thousands of years. The Vorath didn't know we'd ever known it, because they thought of us as a technological species and didn't bother to look at our history from before the technological age. That was their mistake, not a small one. I strung it with nettle fiber cordage that Finn had helped me process and ply. The first draw was terrifying. Your first bow is always terrifying. You're never sure it won't snap on you, but it held. And it shot. Not as well as my compound bow. The draw weight was about 40 pounds, which is modest. I'd had my compound set to 65. But 40 pounds will drive an arrow through a target at 20 yards with enough authority to make the point very clearly. I cried a little when it worked. I'm not ashamed of that. I cried because I'd worked for 11 days on something while being afraid the whole time that I was wrong about the materials, wrong about the technique, wrong about everything. And it worked. And I thought about my grandfather, who taught me to make the first one when I was 12, and I thought about all the people before me who'd made this same object for the same reason, because they needed to defend what was theirs, and something settled in my chest like a key turning in a lock. Then I started teaching Tomoko. When Marin showed me the first bow, I understood immediately what she was doing and what my role should be. I had spent 20 years making Bakken and Jo and Shinai for a dojo, wood weapons. I knew what wood could and couldn't do. I knew the grain, the way force traveled through a piece, the places where it would hold and the places where it would fail under stress. But I had also studied traditional Japanese weaponry in depth, not just modern martial arts applications, but historical methods. I knew how Japanese craftsmen had made weapons from bamboo and horn and wood and plant fiber. I knew how the Naginata had developed from simple agricultural tools. I understood that there was a very long human history of making things that worked from what was immediately available. Marin had the forest knowledge. I had the craft knowledge. We worked together every day for 3 weeks. The second and third bows were better than the first. We were learning together, adjusting, fixing mistakes. By the 5th bow, we were producing something that had a draw weight of 55 to 60 pounds and a reasonable effective range. By the 8th, we had started experimenting with arrow shafts. She knew a stand of straight-grained cedar that was nearly perfect for the purpose, and the combination began to feel less like an experiment and more like a system. We also made knives. This was Marin's idea, and it was more complicated because the Dominion had specifically removed metal blades, but they hadn't removed stone. There is a technique called flint knapping. It is the process of shaping stone, flint, obsidian, chert, certain other fine-grained silicates, by striking it with another hard object to produce a controlled fracture, a sharp edge. Human beings were making flint tools and weapons 2.5 million years ago. Marin had studied flint knapping as part of a wilderness survival curriculum she'd helped develop years earlier. She wasn't an expert. She was competent. She spent 2 days finding the right stone in the creek beds and ridge outcroppings nearby. She came back with material and she sat down and she started working, and she looked up occasionally and said things out loud, not to me, to herself, like, "The platform angle is wrong, and this one's too coarse, the flakes aren't consistent," and there. By the end of the 3rd day, she had produced a biface, a stone blade, double-edged, roughly the shape of a large leaf, that was sharp enough to shave with. I tested it on the back of my arm. It was sharp enough to shave with. She was almost embarrassed by how pleased she was. She kept turning it over in her hands. She said, "My dad would have loved this. He was always going on about the intelligence built into old technologies. He said we'd forgotten more than we remembered." I think she was right about that. Witness testimony, Dona's Pellery recording subject, Benoit Delacroix. My brother and I, we understood wood. Not the way you learn in school, the names of species, the hardness ratings, that kind of thing. We understood wood the way you understand it when you've been working with it your whole life, when your father worked with it, when you can look at a living tree and understand what it would be after it was cut. The grain, the moisture content, the way it would behave under stress. Wood is not one thing. Each tree is its own personality. You learn to read it. When Marin started explaining what she needed, Matthew and I understood right away. She needed a supply chain. Not a dramatic thing, just an understanding of where to find the right material, how to harvest it without leaving a pattern that Dominion surveillance would identify as organized activity, how to season and process it and move it from the forest to the people who needed it. We thought about this the same way we thought about any logging operation. You have your high-value material, in our case, yew for bows, certain cedars for arrows, ash and oak for handles and shafts. You have your supporting material, the stuff that's less critical but still useful. You have your waste, which in our case wasn't waste because fen had uses for almost everything. We organized it into a harvest rotation that moved slowly through different sections of forest and never touched the same area twice in less than 3 weeks. We never moved in groups of more than 3. We never carried anything that looked like organized harvesting equipment. We looked like people going for walks in the woods. We were men who had walked in woods our entire lives. We knew how to look like that. What I remember most from those early weeks is the silence. Not the silence of fear. I felt that kind of silence. It's heavy and wrong. This was a working silence. The kind of quiet where people are paying attention, moving carefully, doing what needs to be done. I found it almost peaceful, which seems strange to say. I think what it was, we finally had a task that matched our actual skills. All my life I'd been told that what I knew was a dying thing, that logging and forestry were old-world industries being replaced by something more modern. And here we were, and the modern things had been taken away, and suddenly everything I knew was exactly what we needed. That felt like something. I don't have a fancier word for it. Marin Caldwell, Personal Field Notes, Month 2. Found among archived materials recovered from the Cascades operation, converted from original pencil on bark notation. Day 47. Inventory count today. 9 functional bows at 50 plus lb draw weight, 14 bows at 35-50 lb, 6 bows that are still developing, either seasoning or needing rework. Arrow count, approximately 340. Stone blades, 23 finished, 11 in progress. Wooden spear shafts, 16, tips being fitted. Tomoko is getting frighteningly good at the bows. The one she finished yesterday has a clean 62 lb pull, and the spine on the arrows she's working with is almost perfectly matched to it. She said she sees the wood differently now. She said the bow is in there already, she's just finding it. I know exactly what she means, and I'm glad she said it, because I thought I was the only one. Gregor came to me today and said he thinks the patrol pattern along the eastern ridge has a gap on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. He's been watching for 3 weeks without making it obvious. He has very patient eyes, Gregor. He watches the way older men do, without urgency, like the watching is just part of existing in a place. I'm not thinking about what we do with the gap yet. I'm thinking about what we need to be ready to do something with it. The forest is getting ready. I can feel it. That sounds mystical, and I don't mean it that way. I mean that I know this place, every ridge and water course and game trail and hidden hollow, and I've been walking it differently for the past 3 weeks, not just moving through it but reading it as terrain, thinking about what I would do if I were defending it, thinking about what I would do if I were attacking through it. The trees are not on anyone's side, but the person who knows them best has an advantage. I keep thinking about my grandfather saying, "The land doesn't fight for you, but it will help you if you understand it." I think I understand it. She was teaching all the time. I don't think she slept more than 5 hours in those middle weeks. She would finish a session with one group and walk to the next. She never raised her voice, never showed impatience. Gregor said once that she reminded him of the very best commanders he'd known, the ones who made you feel like you could do more than you thought, just by expecting you to. She had organized us by skill, by interest, and by what the operation needed. Tomoko and 2 others became the bow makers. They worked in Tomoko's barn, which was far enough from the main path that the Dominion drones rarely went over it, and they produced bows at a rate that seemed impossible for 3 people with hand tools. Benoit and Matthew became the material sourcing team. They knew every tree worth knowing, and they moved through the forest like they'd been born in it, which in some ways they had. Fen and a young woman named Sira Albridge. Sira had been a chemistry teacher before the occupation, and was currently the sharpest person in any room she walked into. They handled the fiber work and the adhesive work. Fen had figured out a plant-based adhesive from pine resin and charcoal, and a few other things that he explained to me once, and that I immediately failed to retain, being no scientist, but which worked extraordinarily well for fletching arrows and setting stone knife handles. Old Vasek Kopek, who was 70 years old and had grown up in a part of the world where people remembered older skills better than we did here, taught us to make effective snares and trip mechanisms from wood and vine and stone. He had the patience of someone who had done careful things for a very long time, and he taught with his hands rather than his words, which suited the work. And Marin. Marin was everywhere. She taught archery to people who had never held a bow. She didn't have time for the elegant, slow process of archery training that builds good form over years. She had weeks. She developed a curriculum that prioritized function over form, close range, reliable draw, consistent release. She said, "We're not shooting targets. We're shooting at distances where you can see the whites of their eyes. That changes what matters." She said the most important thing in emergency archery training was not to overthink the shot. Let the body take over. The body learns faster than the mind does. I watched her demonstrate this over and over, putting arrows into a moss-covered log at 30 yards with a consistency that was almost eerie. Then I watched her teach complete beginners to do something reasonable at 20 yards in 10 days. She also taught the terrain. This was the part that I understood least at the time, and that I understand best now, looking back. She walked people through the forest, and she showed them things that I had walked past for years without seeing. She showed them how certain ridgelines created channels of wind that would affect arrow flight. She showed them where the natural ground cover would muffle footsteps and where it would crack. She showed them the hollows and rock overhangs that offered concealment, and the sight lines that allowed a single person to watch a wide area, and the water courses that would mask sound. She was turning the forest into a fortification. Not by building anything, she added almost nothing, she changed almost nothing. She was pointing at what was already there and saying, "This is a wall, this is a corridor, this is a kill zone, this is a retreat route." The forest didn't change, our understanding of it changed, and in that change everything changed. Witness testimony, Dona's Pellery recording subject, Sira Albridge. I was a chemistry teacher. High school, actually. I wasn't even a university-level chemist. I was the person who taught 15-year-olds about the periodic table and tried to make it interesting. But I'd always been fascinated by materials, by what things are made of and how they behave and why. When Marin and Fen started working on adhesives and I understood what they were trying to do, I got interested in the problem in a way that sort of took me by surprise. The arrow problem was multifaceted, which is what made it interesting. You need the shaft, cedar was good, we had cedar. You need the fletching feathers, and we had birds, and the feathers from certain wing primary feathers are almost exactly what you want, though getting enough of them required collecting from carcasses and molt piles, which Gregor and Vasek organized because they had the patience for it. You need the knock, the notch at the back end that sits against the bowstring, and this we carved from dense wood. You need the point. The stone points were effective but time-consuming to make and inconsistent in weight, which affects how the arrow flies. We needed a more standardized solution. Tomoko's solution was elegant and should have occurred to me immediately. Bone. Bone can be shaped. Old bone, well dried, can be worked with abrasive stones into a sharp point with a relatively consistent shape. Bone had been used for arrowheads for most of human history. We were surrounded by bones, from Yelena's chickens and rabbits, from deer, from smaller animals. Finn understood the material properties. Tomoko understood the shapes needed. By the end of month 2, we had a standardized bone point arrow that we could produce at about 24 per day when everyone was working on it. The weight was consistent enough that a practiced archer could predict the flight reliably. I remember the day we tested the first full standardized set on a target at various ranges. 20 yards, 30 yards, 40 yards. They flew clean. Marin put 3 in a cluster at 40 yards that I would have been proud of, with a modern compound bow and store-bought arrows. She stood there looking at the target for a moment, and then she turned to us, and she said something I've never forgotten. She said, "Every person in human history who ever needed to defend what they loved figured this out eventually. We're not doing anything new. We're just doing what our species does when it needs to." I didn't say anything. I think most of us didn't. She went back to work. The first contact was not planned. I want to be absolutely clear about that, because there were later suggestions, in the official accounts, in some of the media, that we had orchestrated everything from the beginning as a coordinated military engagement. This is not correct. The first contact happened because one of the Dominion patrol units broke from their standard route and walked into the Eastern Hollow on a Thursday afternoon, and Marin was there with Tomoko running an archery practice session. I saw it happen from the ridge above. There were 4 Vorath soldiers. They were not in combat posture. They were moving casually, the way soldiers move when they are on a patrol that has been uneventful for 47 consecutive days. 2 of them were talking to each other. One was looking at something on a handheld scanner. The 4th was trailing slightly behind. Marin saw them before they saw her. I know this because I saw her movement and it was deliberate and controlled. She brought her hand down in a sharp gesture toward Tomoko, a be still signal, and both of them went motionless. They were against the tree line, in shadow, and the Vorath soldiers were walking into a low area where the light was bright. Shadow against bright light. The soldiers walked within 40 yards of them and didn't see them. Then the trailing soldier, the 4th one, apparently checked something on the same kind of scanner the 3rd one had, and said something that caused the 3rd soldier to come back to look. This led all 4 of them to stop and cluster together about 35 yards from where Marin and Tomoko were standing. I have thought about what Marin's experience was in that moment many times. She must have calculated. She must have run through scenarios. They had 11 bows distributed at that practice session, 7 students in addition to herself and Tomoko, but most of those students were only 6 weeks into their training. The Vorath soldiers were in armor that she had spent considerable time studying and understanding. She'd observed them on many occasions, noted the coverage areas, the gaps, identified the places where the armor had limitations. She chose to let them pass. She waited for almost 20 minutes while 4 alien soldiers stood 35 yards from her small group. She waited. She made no sound. She made no movement. She held that stillness, and the people with her held it because she held it, because whatever she radiated in that moment translated into the group. The soldiers moved on. When they were gone, she let out a single long breath and turned to her students and said, very quietly, "Next time, you'll be ready. Today was practice." She didn't look frightened. She looked like a woman who had learned something useful. I climbed down from the ridge and went to her and I said, "If they had seen you, She said, but they didn't. I said, because you were lucky. She looked at me with those level eyes of hers and she said, no, Gregor, not luck. I chose this position specifically because the sight lines from the east approach favor shadow concealment at afternoon angles. I watched how the sun moved through this hollow for 2 weeks before I chose it for practice. What looked like luck was preparation. I believed her. She was right. She was always frustratingly, precisely right about the terrain. Witness testimony, Dona's Pellery recording subject, Marin Caldwell. The Eastern Hollow was not an accident. I'd spent 3 weeks choosing practice sites before I chose that one, and my criteria were not about comfort or convenience. I chose them based on sight lines, sound channels, approach routes, and proximity to concealment. Every practice session was also a training exercise in being invisible. I wanted my people to know how to vanish into this environment before they ever needed to vanish for real. The Voreth had better technology than us. Better armor, better communications. They had scanners that detected metal and energy signatures. They had drones with sensors I didn't fully understand. What they didn't have was an understanding of organic concealment. Their scans looked for technology. We had no technology. We were people in wool and canvas using wood and stone and plant fiber. We might as well have been invisible to their instruments. Their eyes were better, but they had to be pointed in the right direction. And they didn't know this forest. I knew this forest. I knew where the light fell at what time of day, and in what season, and how a person standing in a particular place at a particular hour would be in full daylight or deep shadow, depending on choices I could make in advance. I knew where sound traveled and where it was absorbed. I knew the game trails that crossed the major patrol routes and how they could be used to move perpendicular to a patrol without being seen. I knew the ridgelines that gave you observation over a wide area while leaving you silhouetted against nothing. That knowledge was my technology. After the Eastern Hollow incident, I accelerated the timeline for what I'd been thinking about. I hadn't wanted to move toward active engagement. I want to be honest about that. I'm not a soldier. I never wanted to hurt anyone. I'd spent my career taking people into the wilderness and bringing them safely back out. Hunting, yes, but hunting is a relationship with an animal, and with a landscape, it's not violence for its own sake. I was not eager for what I could see coming. But the Voreth were not leaving, and they were not changing. And I'd spent 3 weeks watching the way they treated the people in our community who had stayed in the more accessible areas near the old road. The way they conducted their compliance checks, the casual contempt in their posture, the way they talked about humans when they thought no one understood their language. I speak a little Voreth. I'd been studying it from a linguistic analysis package I found in our early days before the communication suppression. Someone had built a translation tool from early contact recordings. It wasn't perfect. It was enough. What I heard them say in the first weeks, in those casual conversations when they thought they were unwatched, I don't need to repeat it here, but it clarified my thinking. They didn't see us as opponents. They saw us as a management problem, a tidying up exercise, a species that had produced some interesting technology and some cultural artifacts worth cataloging, and that was now, in their view, simply to be contained and gradually processed into something more useful to the Dominion's purposes. That made me angry. Not the hot kind of angry that makes you stupid, the cold kind that makes you very, very clear. I made a decision. I started planning the first operation. In the old country, where I grew up, we had a word for someone like Marin. I won't try to say it in English because it doesn't translate well. The closest I can get is something like a person who is made of the same material as the land they live in, an expression meaning that the person and their place are not separate things. She came to me at the end of month 2 and asked me about traps. Not for animals, she already knew that, she'd grown up knowing it. She asked me about traps for larger things, for things that moved in formation, in patterns, for things that were looking in the wrong directions. I had been a soldier, a long time ago and in a different world, but once you have done that work you know things that don't leave you. You know how a patrol thinks. You know the rhythms of a force that has been in a low-threat environment for too long. They relax. Their attention softens. Their route becomes predictable because predictability is comfortable, and comfort is the enemy of vigilance. The Eastern Patrol Unit had been predictable for 7 weeks. We knew exactly where they went, and when they went there, and how long they spent at each point, and what their sight lines were at each stage. We knew the 2 points in their route where they had blind spots, places where the terrain features broke line of sight from the drone coverage, and where 2 or 3 minutes could pass with minimal observation. Marin had been watching one of these blind spots for 3 weeks. A section of trail that dipped into a gully between 2 rock formations, where the coverage gap was approximately 4 minutes and 20 seconds on their Tuesday and Thursday routes. 4 minutes and 20 seconds was more than enough. She explained the operation to 7 of us. She was very clear and very detailed, and she answered every question. She never dismissed a question. She never made anyone feel foolish for asking. When she was done explaining, she asked each of us to tell her in our own words what we understood the plan to be. She wanted to know if the understanding was consistent. Where there were gaps, she filled them. She said, "I want no one acting alone. I want no improvisation. I want every person to know exactly what they are doing and to do only that thing. If something goes wrong, the priority is always to extract cleanly. Nothing we accomplish tonight is worth one of our people." She said, "We are going to convince them that this forest is dangerous. We are not going to harm anyone if we can possibly avoid it." Then she showed us the trap. Witness testimony, Dona's Pellery recording, subject, Tomoko Ishii. I should explain the nature of the trap before I explain what happened. The Voreth patrol equipment included devices they carried that acted as personal protection fields, a kind of localized energy barrier that would deflect standard projectiles. This was the main reason why Marin had not moved to direct engagement sooner. You couldn't simply shoot them. But the field required the device to be worn on the body, attached to the armor. And the field had a coverage profile. It protected the front and sides, but the coverage at the back was partial, and the coverage at the lower extremities was the thinnest. More importantly, the device was a piece of technology. It interacted with the world in technological ways. It reacted to fast-moving metallic or high-energy objects. It had been designed in a galaxy where weapons were technological. Stone arrowheads at relatively slow speed through a wooden shaft created a very different signature than a metal-jacketed high-velocity round or an energy weapon pulse. We didn't know for certain that the field wouldn't respond. But Marin's analysis, based on observing a Dominion technical training video she'd found before the communication suppression, and on Fenn's understanding of field physics as he'd studied it, suggested that the protection fields might not fully recognize what we were sending. She was right. The first arrow, shot from 40 yards by Marin herself, passed through the edge of the field with approximately 60% of its velocity retained and struck the rear surface of the last soldier's armor with enough force to register as a significant impact. The armor held. It was still armor, but the impact was substantial and unmistakably deliberate. What happened next was not what the soldiers expected. They expected to receive fire from a direction they could identify. They expected a target that their sensors could locate and that their weapons could engage. They expected, in short, a technological opponent. Instead, they received a second arrow from a different direction. And then, when they moved to seek cover, they found that the apparent cover, a specific rock outcropping, had been pre-selected by us specifically, because it channeled them toward a third position where Vasek and Benoit had set a series of trip mechanisms that brought a controlled cascade of loose timber down across their retreat route. No one was harmed. I want to be clear about this. Marin's planning specifically avoided anything that would cause serious physical injury. The timber cascade was designed to create noise, confusion, and obstruction, not to crush or wound. But it was profoundly disorienting. And in the aftermath, when the patrol called for backup and the backup arrived and swept the area, they found nothing. 4 sets of human footprints. We'd worn improvised bark-soled foot coverings that didn't leave a distinctive tread pattern, heading in 4 different directions, none of which led to any of our actual locations. They found 2 arrows, which Dominion analysts took back to their station, and which I would have loved to be in the room when they examined, stone-tipped, wood-shafted, nettle fiber-fletched. Materials from 6,000 years before the Vorath knew humans existed. I imagine their analysts were very confused. Dominion Military Log, Station Commander Vreth 7, North Cascades Sector. Day 71 of occupation, translated from Vorath Standard. Security Incident, Eastern Patrol Route, Grid Reference 7 November 4. Eastern Unit Alpha 6 reports contact with unknown hostile force. 2 impacts on rear armor of soldier Kelithro, assessed as projectile weapons, material analysis attached. 1 supply obstruction via deliberate timber deployment. Material analysis of recovered projectiles classification, primitive organic construction. Stone point, organic wood shaft, organic fiber fletching. No identifiable energy signature. No metal content. Preliminary assessment, handmade pre-technological. This is contradicted by accuracy of placement and apparent tactical sophistication of the engagement. Pre-technological accuracy and pre-technological coordination are inconsistent with the current human population profile in this zone. Threat level revised, elevated. Requesting additional surveillance assets and a technical team to assess whether pre-technological weapons production by human subjects is occurring. Personal note from Commander Vreth 7. I have reviewed the footage. The human subjects in this zone, I am told, were assessed as non-threatening wilderness residents with limited tactical capability. I am no longer confident in this assessment. Something is happening in this forest that our sensors are not reading. I recommend a comprehensive zone sweep. I expected the sweep. I'd planned for the sweep. In a way, I needed the sweep. The sweep was the Dominion's instinctive response to an ambiguous threat. Send more units into the area, saturate it with sensors, push the threat into the open. It works against a conventional opponent. Against a conventional opponent, you push them into the open and they have to stand and fight or run and be seen. We didn't need to do either. When the sweep began, 14 soldiers in 4 teams, plus 3 additional surveillance drones overhead. We weren't in the forest. Or rather, we were in the forest, but we were in parts of the forest that the sweep wasn't searching. And we knew exactly where the sweep was because Gregor had a vantage point on the high ridge that let him watch their entry formations. And we had a relay system using reflected light signals, no electronics, no emissions, that let his observations reach me within about 3 minutes. The Vorath walked through the forest for 6 hours. They found the places where we'd been. They found the trail I'd deliberately left showing the fire circle at the old campsite. That was a legitimate fire circle. We used it openly. There was nothing incriminating about it. They found the workshop in Tomoko's barn and found nothing there either, because we'd moved everything 3 days before. They found Yelena's fiber processing setup, which appeared to be exactly what it was, women processing plant fiber for textile use. Nothing on their weapons list. They found Fenn in his herb garden, harvesting rosemary, and he looked up at them with the expression of a very old man who was mildly irritated at the interruption to his work and said, "If you're looking for the dangerous herbs, there aren't any. Everything here is culinary." They found me on the river path, walking my cats. I had Ptolemy on a lead and General was following under his own power because General does not do leads. I was wearing old hiking clothes and carrying a pack that contained water, lunch, a topo map, and a compass. I looked like exactly what I was, a wilderness person having an ordinary walk. One of the soldiers stopped me and asked questions via translation device. I answered everything honestly and calmly. I told them I'd heard there was some sort of incident on the Eastern Trail and hoped everyone was all right. I expressed what I hoped was appropriate civilian concern. The soldier looked at me for a moment. I don't know how to read Vorath faces very well, but I thought something was happening behind the eyes and then moved on. After the sweep, I walked back to the meeting point, sat down and wrote in my notebook. What I wrote was, they have the technology to see everything. They don't have the knowledge to understand what they're seeing. Those are different things. Use the gap. Witness testimony, Dona's Pellery recording subject, Gregor Marchetti. After the sweep failed, Marin changed her approach. Before the sweep, we had been building capacity, making bows, making arrows, training people, learning the terrain as tactical infrastructure. Everything pointed toward some eventual confrontation, but we hadn't committed to a specific shape for it. After the sweep, Marin understood something that she explained to us at the meeting that night. She said, they are not going to leave on their own. They are going to stay and figure this out, or they are going to escalate into a response that hurts people, or they are going to call for reinforcements. None of those is good for us. We need to change the calculus so that this location becomes more trouble than it is worth. She paused. She had that look she got sometimes, eyes not quite focused, processing something internal. She said, we need to make them feel unsafe here, not occasionally, constantly. Every time a patrol goes into these woods, something needs to happen that they can't explain and can't stop. Not harm, we're not trying to hurt anyone. We're trying to make them understand that this forest is not a place they can operate in with impunity. Then she said something I think about still. She said, the forest is the weapon. We are just the people who know how to use it. What followed over the next 3 months was something that military historians, I understand, have since written about extensively. I'll tell you what it was from the inside. It was exhausting and methodical, and often frightening and punctuated by moments of something I can only call exhilaration. It was nothing like war in the way that word sounds when people use it dramatically. It was more like very high-stakes problem-solving at a pace that didn't allow for rest. Marin had designed a system of actions that she called operations, though we didn't use that word at the time. We just called them tasks. Each task had a clear objective, a clear method, a clear exit plan, and a clear assessment of acceptable risk. The tasks escalated in complexity as our capacity grew. The early tasks were about disruption and disorientation. Trip mechanisms at patrol route points, time to activate just after a patrol passed, not to harm, but to create the impression that the forest itself was responding to their presence. Sounds, sometimes, channeled through the terrain to appear from directions no sensor could locate. The occasional arrow, never aimed to injure, always aimed to impact non-critical surfaces, appearing from impossible angles. The Vorath patrols started behaving differently within 3 weeks. You could see it in their movement patterns. They slowed down. They clustered more closely. They changed their routes frequently, which helped them less than they hoped because Marin had studied enough alternate routes that she'd anticipated the changes. I was part of the team that handled what we called the sensory operation. The Dominion's detection equipment was calibrated for technological threats. It was very good at detecting electromagnetic emissions, metallic objects, chemical propellants, energy signatures. It was poor at detecting combinations of organic materials in a forest environment where organic materials were simply part of the background. We exploited this ruthlessly. We developed a method for placing reflective surfaces, polished pieces of obsidian, the shiniest stones we could find, in positions that confused drone optical systems in specific light conditions. Fenn and I spent 2 weeks working out the angles. We also developed materials, plant-based mixtures, harmless but pungent, that could be distributed upwind of patrol positions in ways that affected the Voreth's sensory apparatus. Their olfactory biology was similar enough to ours that certain concentrations of compounds that plants produce naturally, in high enough concentrations, caused them to experience something like disorientation. Was that an attack? I've thought about it. Fenn said it was the equivalent of releasing a very strong smell, unpleasant, briefly disorienting, not harmful. Marin approved it and set a condition. If any Voreth soldier showed signs of real distress, we stopped immediately. In practice, it just made them uncomfortable and confused. We were making the forest feel alive, and hostile and incomprehensible. That was the whole point. Summary of engagement incidents since day 71, 47 individual events. Categories: projectile impacts 27, mechanical disruptions 11, sensory events 9. Casualty count, 0 injury count, 3 minor, 2 twisted limbs from trip mechanisms, 1 soldier with persistent sensory disturbance. Equipment damage, 2 drones with sensor arrays compromised by unknown optical interference, 1 scanner with corrupted read due to apparent organic contamination. Despite 47 events across 63 days, no hostile individual has been identified, apprehended, or even clearly observed. The hostile force is operating with effective invisibility within the target zone. Technical analysis of projectile weapons recovered. Pre-technological construction confirmed. Stone, bone, wood, organic fiber. No identifiable manufacturing signature. These objects should not be producing the tactical results we are observing. Our assessment team cannot reconcile the theoretical capability of these weapons with the actual tactical sophistication of their deployment. Psychological effects on personnel. Significant. Soldiers operating in this zone report persistent unease. 3 have requested transfer. Standard patrol duration in the target zone has required reduction because extended time in the area produces measurable stress responses. This is a forest, inhabited by approximately 40 unarmed humans and their domestic animals. I am reporting that our garrison of 80 trained soldiers is experiencing operational stress and tactical difficulty in this zone. I recognize how this reads. I am reporting it accurately. Witness testimony, Dona's Pellery recording subject, Marin Caldwell. I should talk about the wolves. People who have heard about this think it's more dramatic than it was. The wolves weren't cooperating with us. They're wolves, not soldiers. But I'd spent my career in wolf country, and I understood their behavior and their range patterns in a way that turned out to be relevant. There was a pack that used the Eastern Territory. 7 wolves, family group, well established. They'd been there for years. I knew their range from the tracking work I'd done and from my mother's old research. The Voreth patrols, in their new routes, had started cutting through one of the pack's core territory areas. The wolves responded the way wolves respond to intrusion. They were vocal about it. They marked aggressively, and they made their presence clear in ways that the Voreth found extremely alarming. I didn't do anything to cause this, but I did make a decision not to redirect it. There is an ethical question there that I think about sometimes. The wolves were responding naturally, and I let that response serve our purposes. The wolves were not harmed, the Voreth, to their credit, didn't try to injure them, perhaps because they were genuinely uncertain about the nature of the threat they faced by that point. The wolves were just being wolves. But from the outside, from the Voreth perspective, the forest was attacking them with organic projectiles from invisible humans, and now also with large territorial predators. Their threat assessment matrix had no category for this. I remember Fenn reading me the translated portion of one Dominion report that our intelligence had intercepted. He read it in his careful, quiet voice, and when he got to the part where the Dominion station commander wrote that he did not understand what was happening in this forest, Fenn put the paper down and looked at me and said, "Your father would have been delighted." I said he would have been terrified and then delighted. Fenn said yes, in that order. By month 5, the situation had changed in ways that we couldn't have fully predicted. The Dominion had reduced the size of their force in our sector. They'd also pulled back the perimeter of their active patrol zone. They weren't admitting defeat. They were engaging in the kind of strategic repositioning that lets an organization say to itself that it has made a rational tactical decision, rather than admitting that 40 unarmed people in a forest had made their operation untenable. I recognized this pattern. I'd seen it before, in a different war, in a different part of the world. Marin recognized it too. She sat with me one evening. This was late in month 5. The nights were getting colder, the first frost had come, and she said, "They're going to do one of two things. They're going to withdraw from this sector and claim it was always the plan. Or they're going to escalate with something we can't counter with bows and stone knives." I asked her which she thought it would be. She said she didn't know. She said she'd been watching the command patterns and there had been a change at the station level, a different energy signature at the installation, different light patterns which suggested different personnel, a new commander. She said, new commanders either want to make a name by succeeding where the last one failed, or they assess the situation honestly and pull out. I don't know which type we have. She paused. She said, I need to show them something that makes the cost-benefit calculation completely clear. I need to make it undeniable that staying is more expensive than leaving. She looked at me and I saw something in her face that I hadn't seen before. Not fear exactly. More like the weight of a decision. Like someone picking up a stone and knowing it's heavier than they expected. She said, I know how to do it, but it means doing something more direct than we've done. It means making it impossible to misunderstand. I said, tell me. She told me. Witness testimony, Dona's Pellery recording subject, Marin Caldwell. The installation was at the edge of the old park boundary. They'd used an existing building as the base because the structure was sound and large and had power infrastructure. It was not in the forest. It was in a cleared area with wide sight lines specifically to prevent what we'd been doing in the woods. I'd been studying it for months. What I knew, it had a perimeter of 30 meters of clear ground in every direction, surveillance systems covering all approaches, soldiers on rotation at observation points, everything designed to detect and stop a technological threat. What I also knew, they had a waste heat outlet on the north-facing side, at ground level. Warm air came out of it constantly. The coverage on the north side was marginally weaker because the approach from the north crossed the densest section of forest, and they had concluded it was tactically unlikely. They were not wrong about the approach difficulty. They were wrong about whether it mattered. I am a good archer. I want to be honest about what I mean by that. I am not an Olympic archer. I am not a competition circuit specialist. What I am is someone who has shot tens of thousands of arrows over 30 years, in all conditions, at all ranges, and whose understanding of how to use terrain, wind, and light to reach a target is part of how I inhabit the world. At 75 yards in low light from the edge of the tree line, I put 5 arrows into the waste heat outlet cover. They weren't trying to damage anything critical. They were carved with a message. In Voreth script because I'd been practicing for 6 weeks. 6 characters, each carved into the shaft of a separate arrow. The message translated roughly as, "This forest remembers." I know that sounds like something from a story. I know it sounds like the kind of thing someone thinks of in retrospect and claims they said. But I'd been thinking about what message to send for 3 months, and that was the one I kept coming back to. Not a threat, not a boast, just a statement of the fact that seemed most important. We were not going away, we were not giving up, we were still here, and we knew every inch of the ground they thought they controlled. The arrows landed exactly where I wanted them. I was back in the tree line, and gone before the first guard turned around. Incident at Installation Alpha North Wall. 5 projectiles, organic construction recovered from waste outlet housing. Message carved in standard Voreth characters on each shaft. Translation confirmed. This forest remembers. The projectiles reached the installation perimeter from a distance exceeding 70 meters. No sensor alert triggered. No shooter identified. Projectiles are identical in construction to all other recovered weapons from this zone. I have reviewed the complete incident record for this sector. My assessment: this engagement cannot be resolved by conventional means within acceptable cost parameters. The hostile elements operating in this zone have demonstrated a tactical framework that our standard counterinsurgency protocols are not designed to address. They use no technology we can detect. They operate within a terrain environment. They understand at a level our forces do not, and cannot match without a significant retraining program that would require more time than is justified by the strategic value of this location. My recommendation: reclassify this zone as high-resistance territory and redeploy assets to priority sectors. I am aware that this recommendation will be viewed unfavorably. I am making it anyway because it is accurate. They left on a Tuesday morning. I don't know why that detail stays with me, that it was a Tuesday, ordinary midweek, the kind of day that usually involves washing and mending and checking on the chickens. Gregor came in from the ridge where he'd been watching, and he said, very quietly, "They're going." We stood on the porch, Gregor and I and Tomoko, who was visiting for the morning, and we watched the distant flicker of their vehicles moving away along the old highway corridor. And it was strange because after 7 months of building and training and planning and carrying out 100 small, careful operations, the ending was just movement, just departure, just absence where presence had been. Tomoko sat down on the porch step. She was quiet for a while, and then she said, "I keep expecting there to be more to it." I understood what she meant. We sent word through the network. Within an hour, people were arriving from all directions, from the hollows and the ridge camps and the river path and the deep forest. Fenn came with the particular expression he had when something had happened that confirmed a theory. Vasek came leaning on his walking stick, not saying much. The Delacroix brothers came together, which was how they always came. Marin was the last to arrive. She'd been on the North Ridge when the withdrawal began. She'd seen it first, from the best vantage point, the way she always had the best vantage point on everything. She walked down through the trees and across the meadow, and there was frost still on the grass, and her breath made small clouds in the morning air. She had Ptolemy with her. The cat rode on her pack sometimes, which was absurd and completely normal for her. General was nowhere in sight, which was also completely normal. She stopped in the middle of the group and looked around at all of us, and I think none of us knew what to say, which is also what she was feeling, because she didn't say anything for a moment either. Then she said, "I should check the cabin, make sure everything's all right." And she turned and walked toward home. We followed her, all of us, not because she told us to, just because that seemed like the right direction. Witness testimony, Dona's Pellery recording subject, Marin Caldwell. General was on the cabin windowsill when I got there. He looked at me with the expression of an extremely judgmental creature who had spent 7 months watching humans behave with unnecessary drama, and then he yawned. I stood in the doorway of the cabin for a minute. The stove had gone cold while I was on the ridge. The topo maps were still on the table. The notebook I'd been writing in since month 1 was on the shelf. The woodworking tools were in the shed. The bows we'd made, the ones that had stayed here, were hanging on the wall. It looked like an ordinary life. I want to be honest about what I felt. I didn't feel like a winner. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired and relieved, and something else that I don't have a clean word for. Something like the particular sadness of being able to stop doing a thing that you didn't want to be doing in the first place. I had spent 7 months learning to be something that I chose to become because circumstances required it. I had been good at it in ways that surprised even me, but it had not been what I wanted. I had wanted to be a wilderness instructor. I had wanted to take people into the forest and show them what they were capable of. I had wanted my life, which had been a good life. The Voreth had taken that from me for a while. But they hadn't changed the fact that I knew this forest. They hadn't changed the fact that my grandfather had taught me to make a bow when I was 12. They hadn't changed the fact that my mother had known the name of every bird, and my father had understood the language of the underground networks beneath our feet. What I understood, standing in that doorway, was something I'd been circling around for 7 months. They had taken away every weapon. And so I'd made more. I'd made them from the forest because the forest is where I am from, not metaphorically, actually. The wood of the bow was from here. The stone of the knife points was from the creek beds I'd played in as a child. The fiber of the bowstrings was nettle from the meadow where my mother had showed me how to identify plants when I was 7 years old. They had tried to separate us from our capability, but our capability was not in the objects they took. It was in the knowledge that made those objects possible. It was in the 30 years of paying attention to a place. It was in a grandfather's patient hands, guiding a 12-year-old through the shaping of her first bow. You can confiscate a weapon. You cannot confiscate what a person knows. That's what I would want people to understand, looking back. That's the thing. After the occupation ended, I expected things to go back to the way they were before. They didn't entirely, not because anything was broken, because something had grown. The network Marin had built, the connections between people who had lived in the same general area for years without really knowing each other, those didn't dissolve when the reason for them dissolved. We kept meeting. We kept sharing things. We kept being interested in each other in the way you are interested in people who have been through something difficult alongside you. Vasek kept teaching. He taught the old trap methods to young people who found them interesting, which I would not have predicted before the occupation. Tomoko's barn became something of a local craft center, bow making for the pure pleasure of it, wood carving, fiber work. She started hosting regular sessions. The Delacroix brothers expanded their operation. They developed, during the occupation, a much more systematic understanding of the forest's resource management, and they turned that into a consulting practice. They work with conservation groups now. Sierra went back to teaching chemistry, and now she also teaches a materials science elective that covers traditional organic materials. The kids apparently love it. And the knowledge we generated, Marin made sure all of it was documented. The bow-making techniques, the fiber processing, the flint knapping, the terrain reading, the principles of operating in natural environments without technological support. She put it all into a curriculum, and she now teaches it widely, not as a military thing, but as a survival thing, a cultural thing, a human thing. She says it should never be lost again. She is right. Witness testimony, Dona's Pellery recording, subject, Tomoko Ishii. What I think about most is the first bow. Not the best bow we made much better ones later. The first one, the one Marin built in 11 days from a Pacific yew stave and nettle cordage. It hung on her cabin wall the whole time. She never took it down. She said it was the most important object she owned because it was the proof. The proof of what? I asked her once. She said, proof that we hadn't forgotten, that the knowledge was still in us, that you could take away everything we'd built in the last 500 years and we would still be here with our hands and our understanding of materials, making what we needed. The species that invented this bow was still in us. All of us. That was the proof. I understood what she meant. The Vorath looked at us and they saw what we'd built, the technology, the infrastructure, the complicated civilization, and they thought that was us. They thought the civilization was the species. They were wrong. We are older than our civilization. We were making bows before we made cities. We were reading the land before we had written language. We were surviving in environments that should have killed us, by paying attention and adapting and making what we needed from what was around us. The civilization is what we built. The thing that builds is what we are. They took away what we built. They couldn't reach what we are. Witness testimony, Dona's Pellery recording subject, Maren Caldwell final entry. Someone asked me recently what I would say if I could speak directly to the Vorath commanders who ordered the weapons confiscation. I've thought about that question. I think I would say, I understand why you did it. On paper, it made complete sense. You identified the objects we used as weapons and you removed them. You checked the boxes. You followed the protocol. And if we had been the species you thought we were, a technological species that was entirely dependent on its technology, it would have worked. But we are not that species. We are the species that looked at a glacier advancing across a landscape and figured out how to survive it. We are the species that looked at deserts and oceans and Arctic ice and the vacuum of space and found a way to go there and live there, or at least visit. We are the species that has, over our history, developed and then lost, and then redeveloped knowledge so many times that some part of us has learned to hold onto the core of it. The capacity, the ability to learn and make and adapt, even when the specific manifestations get lost. You took my rifles, I made bows. You took my compound bow, I made a U-self bow. You took my hunting knife, I made stone blades. You took everything on your list. You didn't know about the things that weren't on the list. You didn't know about 30 years of paying attention to a place. You didn't know about a grandfather's patient teaching. You didn't know about a scientist father's love for the intelligence embedded in old things. You didn't know about a forest that a woman knew better than she knew anything else in the world. Those things weren't on your list. They should have been. But I'm glad they weren't. Archival closing note. This testimony has been compiled, verified, and filed with the United Earth Remnant Council Historical Accountability Office. The North Cascades engagement is now cited in 14 separate academic studies on asymmetric resistance strategy and pre-technological warfare adaptation. Maren Caldwell's documented knowledge systems, terrain reading, organic materials production, traditional weapon making under resource denial conditions, have been formalized into the UER Council's Resilience Education Initiative, now operating in 47 regional centers. The bows made during the occupation are divided between the Cascades Community Archive and several individuals who made them. The first bow, the 11-day U-self bow, remains on the wall of a cabin 6 miles from the nearest road, in the care of a woman who still teaches wilderness survival, still tends a garden with too much garlic, and still has one cat who accepts a lead and one who absolutely refuses. The forest is still there. It still remembers.